Hello, good evening, everybody in India. Good afternoon to the folks in Europe. Good morning to the folks in New York. So, this is an event today being organized by Nishith Desai Associates, and it's about exits from private equity and venture capital investments. I will briefly introduce the firm of Nishith Desai Associates in a minute, as well as our speakers today. So Nishith Desai Associates is a research and strategy-driven international firm with offices in Mumbai, Palo Alto, Silicon Valley, Bangalore, Singapore, New Delhi, Munich, and New York. Its team comprises of specialists who provide strategic advice on legal, regulatory, and tax-related matters in an integrated manner derived from key insights carefully culled from allied industries. Nishith Desai pioneered the field of international taxation and the asset management industry. Nishith Desai Associates advised Mauritius and more recently conceptualized the Gift City financial centers. Nishith Desai Associates has engaged in private equity for over 3 decades and is a thought leader in private equity and legal matters relating to several other areas, including technology. Nishith Desai Associates has remained in the forefront of advances in these fields and has been awarded the Asia's Most Innovative Law Firm Award by the Financial Times for 4 years in a row. Given NDA's deep involvement in private equity, it provides invaluable insights for the benefit of its clients, the ecosystem, as well as the regulatory agencies. Many of these insights are published regularly and can be accessed via Nishith Desai newsletters and special reports available on NDA's website. I would like to now introduce our honored guests who are going to be speaking today. We have Darius Pandole. He's the Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer of the private equity fund management business of JM Financial. He has 28 years private equity experience. He used to be at New Silk Route Advisors. He was with IDFC Private Equity, in Asia Fund Advisors. He's also an MBA from the University of Chicago and a BA from Harvard University. Our next guest is TC Meenakshi Sundaram. He's the Vice Chairman of Chirite Partners. Chirite Partners, I'm repeating that because it's not a very common word. He has 38 years industry experience, including 18 years of venture experience. He's a board member of several companies, including Lenskart, Agrostar, etc. He is regarded as a pioneer of India's venture capital industry. He has handled several successful exits. He has been involved in firm building. He has led the fintech sector in India. He has led fundraising for venture capital, several venture capital funds. He was previously with an American venture capital fund by the name of Walden International, and for 14 years he worked at Wipro. I would also like to introduce you to our other speakers from the firm of Nishith Desai Associates. Our moderator today is going to be Ashish Kabra. Ashish is the leader of international tax and dispute resolution, as well as investigative practices. He's the head of NDA's Singapore office. His focus is on commercial litigation, international arbitration, and white-collar crimes. He is an honorary overseas member of the Commercial Bar Association, England and Wales. We have Parul Jain of Nishith Desai Associates. She is a co-head of international tax and fund formation practice. She focuses on international taxation, cross-border tax, including cross-border investments and group reorganization strategies, M&A transactions, and venture capital and private equity funding. She was also part of a SEBI committee on angel fund regulations. We have Basava Rao, who's based out of NDA's Hyderabad office. He has 14 years private equity experience He's been involved in several deals, and I would now like to turn over to the moderator of today's session, Ashish Kabra. Ashish, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, Arvind, and setting the stage. So welcome, everyone. I think we have a very large audience from all across the globe. So a big welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining in. Today's session, we are discussing the exits. This is the 7th session in the series that we have held where we've discussed various nuances starting from the formation stage, and now finally we have come to the exit stage. 2021 in terms of exits has been a landmark year for the private equity and venture capital industry in India. We saw the highest sort of deal activity that has ever taken place. In sheer terms, we almost saw $43.2 billion worth of exits that have taken place over the last year. And so we are right now completely the right time discussing exits. And the last year only reflects that the market in India is a vibrant one, it's a maturing one, and and hopefully would remain so in the coming years. And Arvind said earlier, we've been given the introduction. We're joined by esteemed panelists, TCM and Darius today, and I'd like to start off with them firstly with TCM. TCM, I think at Chirate, you have been involved in a number of successful exits over the years. You have also been part in the 2021, this whole foray of exits that have taken place. You have also been part of that and have been involved in some successful exits. So, and in 2021, we saw exits not just in one particular format or type, right? There was strategic secondary sales which were taking place. There were similarly buyout by other PE players which took place. Obviously, there was a whole flurry of IPO activity which took place, not in resulting in direct exit itself, but also a partial exit, so to say. So we have had all of these exits which have taken place. We know you have also been participating in some. How do you decide when you're looking at a particular company that what exit route is suitable for this company? And at what stage do you take a decision to say exit a particular company?
Yeah, so private equity investment is an area where you start thinking about exit as you start deciding to invest, right? So when you invest, you think about what are the potential exit opportunities, who are the potential acquirers, and in fact, from a due diligence perspective, we do speak to even potential acquirers even at that point in time, though it might be very early in the day. And typically, the exit cycle can be anywhere from 12 to 24 months from the time you think saying that you want to do an exit, right? Depending on market conditions, depending on the specific things associated with the specific asset as well, right? Whether it is IPO or a strategic sale, if it involves a global acquisition. So I think typically the way we look at it as a VC firm is that when we invest, we keep track of the companies, and then based on how they are progressing, we start planning out. Typical investment horizon for us is 5 to 7 years. So anytime from third year onwards, we start looking at how the company's trajectory of growth is, and accordingly start planning what type of exit is possible. And so eventually it results. So just to give you a context, in the last 6 years, the PE investments in India collectively would be close to $200 billion, right? And that means the exits in the next 6 years' time should be a multiple of that, right? If you go by at a portfolio level, what we all collectively have to return to our investors. So it can only get bigger and better. Requires more planning.
Sure. So in terms of the exits that you have undertaken, and I know there'll be some good strategic sales as well involved over the past year, what do you think has been the key to ensuring a successful exit, given your experience?
It's very important that all the shareholders, whether it is founders, various rounds of investors who have come in, are aligned, right? In terms of saying that yes, there is a exit event that has to take place. It could be an IPO, which gives an opportunity for the company to continue to run, or if it's a strategic sale, everyone collectively agreeing, saying that yes, this is the time to do a strategic sale. It may be because in one of the companies that we were exiting last year, there was a debate which we had internally and also with the company, saying that okay, is it time to sell to a strategic, or stay on and then become a unicorn? And in that sector, there is actually a barbell which operates, right? So most of the M&As take place under a unicorn stage, or after that they all happen after a $10 billion valuation, right? So then the question is, do we think this is likely to, we can visualize reaching a $10 billion valuation, or do we think this is a sweet spot? Because you don't want to land in a no man's land, right? So that is one such consideration as to what is the most likely stage at which a company is likely to get acquired. Obviously, in IPOs, if you look at it today, any company which is looking at an IPO valuation less than $5 billion may not get a very serious attraction and interest from foreign institutional investors, or even some of the large Indian institutional investors, just by the sheer check size that they have and the ability to participate in the rounds. So those are considerations which go in terms of when and when to trigger an exit event.
Sure. Let me bring Darius in here for on a point. TCM just mentioned that we had a huge amount of investment taking place over the course of last few years. And going forward, it only means that exits are going to go bigger and bigger. And given the multiple returns that the LPs require, and as I know, TCM, it's about cash on the table and not the valuation in the book to that extent. So we obviously over the last year saw the valuations were obviously were very good. There was liquidity in the market, but now we see that the global headwinds are in a different direction. There's obviously some sort of course correction taking place to check the inflationary pressures which the world is seeing. And at the same time, in Indian context, SEBI, for example, came out in January with some regulations, again, sort of dampening the IPO market, so to say. So if the large exit multiples, such as what TCM is saying, which need to be sort of forecasted in the future as well, but at the same time, we have these other pressures which are taking place today. How do you see the exit market will behave as we move forward or as we move from now on, given the stage that we are at?
Yeah, thanks, Ashish. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So, very pertinent question. And if I might start by saying that as private equity practitioners, probably the most important role that we play when we source deals, we invest in companies, we monitor those companies, we work with the companies, we exit. The most important part is the exit. We typically, as private equity investors, we live and die by the exits. Now, when you look from a macro perspective, the exit story in India initially was rather disappointing. India had relatively few exits, and that had disappointed various global investors. However, very happy to note that in the recent past, in the last 3, 4, 5 years, the exit activity in India has picked up dramatically, culminating in last year, 2021, which was by far and away a record year for exits in India. If my memory serves me right, we had some 250 exits or more, about $40 billion or more of exited value in 2021, more than at any point, any single year in the past. The interesting thing is that all of these exits happened across various manners. So most important was we had secondary sales. I believe we had about $15 billion out of the total $40 billion were in strategic sales. This was done by not just larger cash-rich corporates, but also by PE-funded platform companies that wanted to grow inorganically. And by way of these exits, it'll enable them to both consolidate their market share, but also acquire new capabilities. Other than the strategic sales, the second most frequented manner of exits was the secondary sales, where one PE fund sold their stake to another PE fund, or funds sold in the capital markets, they sold their stake to other primary investors. That also saw record value. Thirdly, also, I think what was touched on earlier, we saw unprecedented IPO activity also last year, where we saw a number of very high profile IPOs happening, and a lot of which PE and VC investors exited. So again, all of these three modes, strategic sales, secondary sales, as well as sales via IPO, happened in abundance last year, as well as the fourth, or probably the least favorite mode of exit from our perspective as private equity investors, where we do company buybacks. Of course, this happened, and this is not the optimal way to exit, but even there we saw a fair amount of activity. So really, all told, a very good year for exits in India. Why is that important? Because this becomes, in some senses, a self-fulfilling prophecy. As you have more exits, you return more money back to our investors, and then the investors want to invest more money back into funds like ourselves. So this thing augurs well for the future. Yes, as we look ahead, we are currently seeing multiple headwinds. Inflation is rearing its head. Interest rate cycle is turning adverse. We have supply chain challenges. So there is going to be, to my mind, a lot of short to medium term volatility. But having said that, from a purely India perspective, I think as TCM pointed out earlier, with a lot of the investment activity that we've seen over the next year or two, we will continue to see a lot of focus on exits and a lot more exit activity. So I think while it's important to look at history, it's fair to say that over time, if nothing dramatic happens, the increased pace of exit activity will continue.
Sure. TCM, if I can just bring you, I know you have to leave very soon for another LP meeting, but let me ask you a question here. We know Chirate is focused in some tech sectors and consumer sectors. How do you see, and the exit activity, at least for the last 2021, the sector which dominated that was tech. Obviously, there were other areas as well, but when you see it, when you look at that, the largest examples were coming out from the tech sector. So how do you see as the exit activity would evolve over the course of next 2 to 3 years, or even a larger horizon as we move?
No, I think, we've got 100 unicorns now, right? So assuming that, there will be, and most of them became unicorns with possibly a certain round taking place. And some of them are, possibly 5 billion and 10 billion valuation. So I think to generate meaningful outcome, they have to also find an exit which is, at least 3 to 5 times that multiple, because the tech sector is expected to generate that type of return. And I think what is going to happen is that how much of it is going to be an IPO type of event, how much of it will be a strategic sale, where possibly like Darius was talking about in terms of platform companies acquiring some of the adjacent players, consolidating the space. So we are in an exciting time in that sense, right? Fintech, as you know, has got the highest number of unicorns, right? Now, are all fintechs going to be potentially existing in an independent capacity, or are they likely to possibly be acquired by some of the large financial players who do not have a footprint, technology footprint, or the type of solution footprint that they have, right? So it will be interesting to watch. I think any traditional player looking at these technology players, the biggest friction point that's going to be is the valuation expectations, because that the tech companies which are growing very rapidly are getting different valuation multiples compared to the traditional companies. So at the time of exit, would the traditional companies be willing to give those higher valuations, or how much compression in the valuation multiples will take place is going to be something that's interesting to watch.
Sure. Also, in terms of because we've obviously seen a flurry of IPOs, right? But most investors cannot exit through the IPO because as it's only a liquidity event, and the exit is only to take place thereafter after the lock-ins expire. So what has been your experience? Because obviously now we are seeing everybody came in with their IPO with the fundraise when the valuations were high, but moving forward, the horizon for capital markets is a bit volatile. So how are you thinking of exits through IPOs as we move forward?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question, right? So we've also had one IPO candidate last year. So I think the way somebody has to look at it is, exit is not a matter of, taking an action impulsively. Uh, Exit is a matter of deliberate action, right? So I think one of the things that I have always seen and be consistent in exits. In fact, that's like Darius was saying. India had one of the biggest concerns that the LPs had used to voice it very vehemently. Used to be the fact that there is not enough cash return, right? So I think the GPs have to think about it on a consistent basis. So coming back to your question, so whenever an IPO comes, there will be enough and more examples that we can speak about where somebody says that, okay, it got priced at the maximum. And then, we thought it will go up. Yes, it did go up. And after that, and market condition like this compared to last year, most of the IPOs which are below their peak, right? Some may be substantially below their even issue price. Some may be marginally. Some may be still below the peak while being higher than the issue price. I think that time there is always this feeling saying that should I have sold in the IPO or not, right? This is a never-ending question. I think everyone lives and learns, and I think being disciplined means, are you going to take risk off the table? Are you going to take exits at every opportunity that it presents itself? That's one way to look at it, because I think in an IPO only 5 or 10% ownership gets uh, uh, you know liquidated. The rest of it you wait over the next few years time to clear.
Sure. Days, same question, similar question to you. I know you've recently also been raising a fund. I've raised the third fund, which is there. And you've obviously had several investments which you have made from the previous funds which are there. How are you looking at exits from those investments? How do you think, what would be your exit cycle? In that sense, what will be the decisions that drive your choice or timing for exit from the companies?
Yeah, Ashish, maybe I'll start with by touching on the earlier question that you had raised
Sure.
to TCM in terms of the IPO market. As I had mentioned earlier, last year was a spectacular year in terms of exits across various modes, including IPOs. We saw from an IPO perspective, we saw not only the largest quantum of IPO value as well as volume that we've ever seen, but we saw certain interesting trends where typically conventional wisdom would say that IPOs of companies that are doing only a secondary exit and not raising primary money would find it very difficult to raise capital. Even those IPOs sail through. Then you had people saying that yes, we are in a very sort of tech intense sector. So if the IPOs of non-tech companies may not happen, but we had some spectacular IPOs from non-tech companies, names like Sham Metallics or Rolex rings come to mind, which were, spectacularly oversubscribed. So the good thing was that the IPO market not only was, very strong last year, but we were seeing sort of old trends and old sort of wisdoms being overturned as newer and newer investors come into the market. Because don't forget, in India, we're in a market where we're seeing a huge increase in the number of domestic investors that are coming to a market. And that in some sense has been holding up the markets even in the past few months when there's been dramatic foreign investment outflow. So that's from the perspective of IPO markets. From the perspective of timing, I think typically we call ourselves, relatively long-term investors. And hence, one of the things that I think TCM very correctly mentioned is that even though we take a longer investment horizon, the planning for an exit starts at the time of making an investment. Because if you go into an investment without having any idea of how you will exit, when you will exit, to whom you will exit, what kind of sort of potential returns can you see at exit, you probably would be in trouble if you don't plan in advance, because that takes time. You then have to work with the company, scale up the company, and then plan for an exit. So typically, we look at about a 4 to 5 year window of time, of which the last 1 or 2 years are really spent trying to work on an exit along with the entrepreneur. But as I had mentioned earlier, as long as the markets continue growing and as long as we can keep doing exits on a consistent basis, hopefully the future of private equity in India will continue to look very positive.
Great. I know TCM has to leave, so let me just put one last question to TCM before he leaves us. And this is connected to two pieces there. One, because we were speaking of the IPO, and we also saw last year an IPO exit, but not an IPO in India, but overseas through the DSPAC route involving Renew Power, where we were actually assisting Renew. What is your take on the DSPAC route as an exit mechanism? And also, do you foresee a increased exit through secondary sale to other PEs as we move forward?
Yeah, I think this pack is an interesting opportunity, but for a niche solution, right? It may not happen in every situation. I think depending on circumstances, this pack provides a very good exit opportunity, because I think there is an overhead which comes in terms of 5 to 15%, and that is something that people should be willing to consider. Um, and the second part is also with respect to saying that, okay, how is it going to perform? See, because when there is going to be a selling shareholder, there's going to be a new set of investors who are coming in, and at least in hindsight, right? This SPAC story has played out, at least for the new investors who have come in, not so very well. So to that extent, it's a question of, because the selling shareholder wants to maximize and the buying shareholder has to get something. So somewhere along the line, the conflicts come out a lot more. But on certain circumstances where possibly there's a large enough pool that is interested in doing it, or there is a new event that is taking place, like the way EV companies went public in US, SPACs may be an interesting opportunity. To come back selling to other PEs, in fact, that's becoming a bigger and bigger opportunity. So last year in our portfolio, there was one $500 million secondary in one of our portfolios, and another one had close to $250 million secondary. That's because companies are going to be there for longer. So there is a renewal or refresh of the investor base that is required. The previous investors after 5 or 6 years want to get out. Company has got a much longer life going forward to become an IPO or whatever. So at that time during the refresh, the companies are now valued several $1 billion. So even a small secondary becomes a meaningful chunk. And those things are happening. There are more and more PEs who are getting interested in companies at this scale.
Sure. Thank you. Darius, I'm coming back again to you because I also want to ask you on your views on those similar aspects. The SPAC potential as we move forward for Indian companies. And second, is sale to PEs also going to be increasingly a route which is going to be adopted as we move forward in 2022 and 2023?
Yeah, let me give my view on both of those. On the first, the SPAC opportunities, we have seen some, few and far between from the Indian perspective of companies doing successful SPACs overseas. Of course, the Renew Power example that you gave is the prime example. But I'm not an expert in that area, but I must tell you that last week I was in New York and I happened to be talking to some bankers, and this topic of SPACs came up quite by chance. And my understanding is that even in the US, which is the home of SPACs and where this whole vehicle was invented, there seems to be a huge amount of regulatory uncertainty. And as a consequence, some of the leading players in SPACs like Goldman, Bank of America, etc., are now intentionally going slow on the SPAC opportunity, at least in the near term, till this regulatory uncertainty is resolved. So to my mind, in the near to medium term, the next sort of 6 months or so, there is a huge amount of uncertainty about this whole sort of SPAC opportunity in the US, which is the home of SPAC. So certainly that is going to trickle down to other markets like India. And my supposition, and I hope I'm proven wrong, but my supposition is that over the next 6 months, I don't think we will see too much SPAC activity, certainly from the Indian market. The second point that you raise is on the P2P sales. That's something I very strongly believe. I've believed actually for the last 5 years that this whole secondary sale from one P investor to another P investor is only going to grow in size, and that has been borne out. I think one of the signs of maturity in the private equity market in India is that now the industry is very nicely segmented. So you have investors all the way from angel and seed investors to venture investors to PE investors to late stage investors to the buyout houses. All the big buyout houses with Warburg, Blackstone, Carlyle, Temasek, etc., are in India. So as a consequence, we're going to see more and more situations where, let's say, a investor, a growth capital investor in a small and mid-cap company comes in, puts in some money, works with the company, improves governance, improves the size and scale of the operations, and then will find a very interesting exit opportunity to a larger PE fund for whom buying out that PE fund stake as well as putting in more primary capital will make it a sizable and interesting investment. So I think that is an area we will continue to see a lot more action, where we're going to see this whole PE to PE or secondary sales, as we call it.
Sure. Let me bring in some of my colleagues now into the discussion as well. We have heard from the market leaders, Darius and TCM, on their views in terms of exits as we move forward. And what we hear is that it's only going to grow in size because the investment activity has been there and the multiples are demanded by the LPs. So, and we have also been involved in quite a few exit deals over the past few years. And I know, Basava, you have been involved in certain of them, particularly on the secondary and strategic side. What has been your experience of negotiating some of those secondary and strategic exit deals, which you would want to share and can be a useful learning? Because as we see that's most likely, as from what at least I hear, the options for exit as we move forward in the years to come.
See, I think, hi, good evening, first of all, to everyone. I think what I have seen as a change in trend is the deal making is much more mature, okay, and the way people are looking at risk or appetite has been, I wouldn't say increased, but people have realized that when you are acquiring a company, yes, there are some inherent risks that come. And that's how I see the deal making being much more mature these days. The asks either from the buyer or the demands from the seller are more and more reasonable these days. They are not going to, the buyer is not going to say, oh, I want everything covered, with respect to the company which I am buying. Neither the seller is saying that, oh, I would not give you any sort of protection once I have sold to the company. So I think what I have seen as a change in trend is the buyer knows, yes, there is some inherent risk. The sellers do understand that, yes, we need to stand behind the company for some reason or to some extent the way to give comfort to the buyer. That is where I think what in the recent trend, this recognition of risk or the existence of risk has, resulted into another piece of reps and warranties insurance taking a predominant role, in deal making. In fact, in almost all the deals which we are looking these days, people are relying more and more on the reps and warranties insurance to cover in terms of liability. But in terms of experience, as what lawyers or someone who is going to play a decent role in an exit, as it doesn't start at the time of exit, but few rounds before the exit, or at least once the company is more or less towards maturity. I think how like TCM and Darius, they have been mentioning that you start thinking of exit at the time of investment itself. So one of the key aspects which we also try to look at while helping out the investors or the company is that how amicable this process can be. How amicably can we put this process into the either into the documentation or into the decision-making processes. I think at times what happens in exit is we don't know either the sequencing of the exit, or at times what happens is we don't know what is the decision-making points of the exit. Who is going to take a call, who is going to lead. I think those nowadays, I think both the investors and companies do understand and have realized once you reach a Series C, Series D situation, they realize that yes, there is a exit which everyone is thinking about, and people have started, focusing more on, what these exits should be, what would be the potential avenues of this exit, who could be our potential buyers. These discussions have taken, a predominant role of late. And which I'm very happy to see that, because how the market is reacting in a much more mature fashion towards exits.
Sure. Paro, let me ask you. You have also been involved in a number of exit transactions. What, according to you, and I know your expertise in the tax domain, so obviously, firstly from the tax side, but feel free if there anything else that you also want to share along with it. What, according to you, have been the key tax considerations from a tax perspective in exit deals which are currently taking place, or or if anyone looking at an exit should be aware of?
Right. Yeah. Thanks, Ashish. And I think this is a very interesting conversation, especially the points brought up by TCM and Darius. And I can relate to what they're saying with respect to at least the part about how the exit is being thought of at the time of investment itself. So we are seeing a lot of structuring being done at the time of investment for exits. Whether it's in the context of SPACs also, and I will talk a lot about SPACs because, Darius himself had mentioned that interest has probably come down in New York, and we'll see how it goes in the next 6 months or so. But even in other deals, people are looking at externalizing structures in order to get, a better exit outside India, whether it's a strategic exit or whether it's with respect to listing on overseas bourses. There are complicated tax and exchange control issues that come when you externalize a structure. Of course, more complexity is there for the promoter because the promoter needs to swap his shares in the Indian company for shares of the foreign entity, which is being set up. And that swap is subject to tax in India. So finding the right manner of, giving the promoter his, his shareholding in the foreign entity is crucial. But also what is important is, in India, as most people are aware, we have what is called an indirect transfer tax, which is that if shares of a foreign entity are sold and the value of the shares is derived from an underlying Indian asset, then investors still have to pay the tax. That's still one of the most contentious issues in India, and that can get into contentions with respect to withholding taxes. India's stand on eligibility to tax treaty benefits is not without doubt on indirect transfers. The case is not yet settled at a high court level, for a particular transaction. And so therefore, that's one of the issues that comes up. Pure play strategic sales or PE exit matters, of course, the most contentious issues, and Basava spoke about how a lot of time is spent in negotiating indemnities. One of the really crucial and pain points in any PE exit is the negotiation of the tax indemnity, and this is important especially if the shares of the Indian entity are grandfathered. By grandfathered, I would mean that investment has been made by the investor from jurisdictions like Mauritius and Singapore, and the tax treaty benefits are available for investments made till 2017. So we are seeing a lot of, while there is a tax exemption for these investments made till 2017, but we have seen that tax authorities do bring up questions with respect to eligibility to treaty benefits time and again. And hence, both the parties spend an inordinate amount of time trying to either, get a suitable indemnity, trying to get a certainty in the form of a nil withholding tax certificate from tax authorities, or in certain cases also going for what we call a tax insurance. So I think that's one of the biggest pain point, withholding tax issues for capital gains tax liability. The other issues would also be, when there is a transaction that takes place, then this infamous section 281 comes into play, whereby the transfer itself, the sale can be held to be void from a tax perspective, not really legally void, in favor of the tax authorities in the event that the seller has any tax dues in India. Now, this is a very open-ended section. Of course, it applies in certain circumstances, and technical, interpretations can be taken. But this is the other area where, a lot of indemnities, representation language, certificates from accountancy firms, or, again, a no objection certificate from tax authorities comes into play. And, both the parties, again, spend a lot of time along with their advisors trying to figure out, what's the right thing to do. I think the third most important thing is, even when we talk about indemnities, we talk about, putting in the suitable form of representations. But what should really be the time period for the indemnity? Now, of course, traditionally, one would have seen the 7-year indemnity period, because that's what was provided in our law till some time back. But the law changed for the better last year, but then changed again this year, for adding to a little bit of a confusion. So the law changed to reduce litigation and to provide for the statutory period of limitation to go down from 7 years to 4 years. But in certain circumstances, it has gone up to 10 years, including for indirect transfer cases. So some of these things which are not clear, they're still in the gray, keeps both the parties, in discussions with each other with respect to what's the right thing to do for tax. And it's one of the most contested indemnity and representation in any type of a strategic sale.
Yeah, I think the point that you made there, in terms of the timeline, I think it is extremely critical from funds, right? Especially exiting funds, because they have their stipulated fund life. And to have an indemnity obligation and a contract which extends beyond that fund life is not something which is feasible. And having a tax risk for 7 years was typically a bone of contention, because if the fund is going to finish before the 7 years, they obviously cannot give that indemnity. And again, the other party would obviously seek that indemnity, because the risk is eventually a tax risk of the seller and not the buyer, because the buyer simply this only has a withholding obligation, but the principal tax liability is that of the seller. So that has often been an issue in, at least in exit transactions. And I think the answer there typically has been in rep and warranty insurance and tax insurances, which obviously the concerned party, or whichever party is negotiable on, can obtain. So that's something that we have very often seen as well, in obviously in exit transactions, the issues in terms of what they arise. Let me just take one more. Basava, I think there's a question from the audience which has been there for a while as well. Would you like to address it? I think the question relates to what were the reasons that SEBI brought in, or were there any regulations that SEBI introduced that effectively dampened the markets, or led to tightening of the sort of the IPO market or regime this year?
Understood. Understood. I think, see, it's not about dampening the markets. I think SEBI has also been taking a cautious role. See, because if you look at the IPO regulations, there are a bunch of regulations which speak about profitability for 3 years. You should have distributed profitability for 3 years, which effectively, and there are certain other conditions which are there before a company can go IPO. Which effectively gives certain stature and credibility to the company. But most of the new age companies, especially in the tech space, most of them are not, not technically profitable companies in terms of balance sheet. But, what SEBI has looked at is how the issue prices are being determined. What is the kind of issue price and what is the basis for the issue price at which is being proposed as part of the IPO. So that is where SEBI felt that there are more and more disclosure requirements that are required as to why a particular price was quoted by a tech company which is listing on the market. I think I wouldn't say yes in the short term we can see that yes it has dampened the spirit a little, but I think in the long run we will have to see it is a it is a cautious move, I think, from SEBI also, because it should not allow people to, unreasonably put a price to the share without any, or with at least with a concrete basis. So I think that's what SEBI has been looking at. Ashish, let me turn the table to you and Darius. We have spoken about a lot of how decision has to be made in terms of exit, and how decision needs to be made in terms of how exits are to be executed. Darius, one thing that really intrigues me is what are the points where you see a little bit of friction between the parties while taking up an decision about exit, etc. What are the areas of friction you generally come to see?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point, Basava, that you raised, because in order to do a good exit, I think it's important that you have an alignment of interest and a meeting of minds with the entrepreneur. Because if the PE investor, especially in cases where he's a minority investor, tries to take a unilateral exit decision without the support and cooperation of the entrepreneur, then invariably it will be a suboptimal exit. So it is very important that we have this meeting of minds. Now, where do sometimes the disagreements come? So firstly, often there's a disagreement on timing. The PE investor may feel that, this is a good time to exit and maybe get another investor in, while the entrepreneur would say, no, don't rock the boat right now. Let's not exit. Another very obvious friction point is the pricing. And here, interestingly, in my experience, what I found is, as a PE investor, when we're happy to exit at a particular price because we're achieving our threshold returns, it is the entrepreneur who then comes back and says, no, don't exit at this price, do it at a higher price, because for the entrepreneur, it's a little bit of a trophy also, that, the higher the price I get, the, greater is the sort of badge of honor that we have. So sometimes there is also an area of friction. And what I've found through, over the last 25 years of experience in dealing with this, it's best to try and highlight as many of these areas of friction that can come up and trying to see how they can be addressed. So the more you can sort of project out that in terms of issues that will come up and try and put in what possible solutions in the documentation, I think the better you are. But ultimately, it's a question of building a relationship with the entrepreneur and developing the mindset right up front that yes, we are limited life investors. We are going to get out in a certain time frame, and you will be helping us in this whole process of an exit. And I think that's probably the most optimal way of structuring an exit in terms of timing, in terms of pricing, as well as in terms of the terms and conditions that either you get, and the entrepreneur may be happy giving it to you, but the entrepreneur not be happy to continue with those terms and conditions with the next investor who comes in, because hopefully over a period of time, he's also in a stronger position and hence doesn't need to give so many of those rights. So yes, there are a lot of pain points and friction points, but the more you can be transparent and open and upfront about it, the easier is the solution later on in time.
Ashish,
Yes, my experience has also been very similar, though I have to say that when I typically get involved, things have gone south a bit further than one would like, at least from a Darius perspective. So we've handled a number of exit-related disputes as well, and I can fairly and safely say that a dispute scenario is not something that any fund manager wants. It's kind of a nuclear button where if you explode a nuclear bomb next to you, there are definitely gonna be some effects that you also face as see. So it's not something that investors would want to do and would very rarely do so. But typically, it definitely gives you a good insight on where the friction arises. And as Darius has pointed out, some of the areas that we have seen are related, like one of the key areas are transfer restrictions. So if you have multiple investors who are there, one investor who wishes to exit, another does not. A question of different perspective on the timing of when an exit should take place. But then again, depending on the provisions in the contract which have been built in, there may be sort of a drag right, or in other ways, ROFR rights, which one may seek to exercise or impose to prevent those. Again, if there is a meeting of mind which has taken place beforehand, then these issues obviously do not arise. But if that is not, then one would obviously explore ways and means to sort of exercise some of those transfer restrictions which are there. We also see, let's say, if you take an example of a drag, once you actually exercise a drag, nobody wants to do it forcefully. But if you do it, then there are issues such as let's say the drag simply is going to be on the same terms. But what do you mean by same terms? Is the other person who is going to be dragged going to give an indemnity? Answer is no. Are they going to give you this rep and warranties? The answer may be no. So those issues will again create friction when you exercise some of those rights which are there. And last, as one more thing is pointed out, you have to build that ideology with the promoter that at certain point in time you will look to exit. But if those do not match and there's differences, then there are obviously because you need promoter cooperation in enforcing your contractual rights and achieving that exit. And we have seen that promoters very frequently rely upon any sort of regulatory objection or any other way that they may have to renege on their contractual obligations. For example, the most common has been relying upon provisions under the Foreign Exchange Management Act, and on those provisions trying to sort of back out from their contractual obligations at the D-Day and prevent an exit. Now, obviously, if you have spoken with the promoter and they have been on board and the situation has, the investment has gone through and company has seen growth, there would not be any issues. But there are some of those unique isolated situations where these instances do arise. But the one thing I can say safely and happily is that if you actually choose a foreign seated arbitration, then some of these objections have been consistently rejected by international tribunals. And those international tribunals typically give primacy to contracts. So the principle of pacta sunt servanda, what you have agreed, you should abide by and uphold. Going from that mindset, they give decisions and rulings, which rulings have also been subsequently enforced and recognized, and the awards have been subsequently enforced and recognized in India. So we have several judgments from various high courts and the Supreme Court dismissing some of these objections and upholding and enforcing those foreign awards in India. We still haven't seen the situation play out in a purely domestic situation, though I again foresee that the answer there would be that those objections should not really come in the way of enforcing contractual obligations. And simply the view is that if you had freely and openly entered into certain contractual obligations, I think those should be upheld and enforced. So that's at least been the trend on the dispute side. And obviously I can go on. There are multiple other genres of disputes that we have come across on the indemnity side, on the warranty side, but I'll pause here. I know we are coming towards near the end of the session. We've also had several questions which our audience has asked, but I think Parul has gracefully answered those in the Q&A window itself for the members. So I think most of them are now answered. What I will do is, if anybody has any closing or last comments, if not, I will bring the session to a close. I will remind the audience and the participants that after this, we also have a coffee corner where they can join in, and we will be there and to answer some of the questions that you may have right now, or to otherwise freely discuss any topics or issues that you may want to address or discuss. But with that, if gentlemen, anybody has no any further comments, otherwise I'll call this session to a close.
I do want to, this is Arvind, I do want to thank Darius in particular. Darius, is so kind of you. I know you just flew in from New York. I really appreciate your participation. And also like to thank the Nishith Desai lawyers. As Ashish said, we are now going to transition to the coffee corner, where the Nishith Desai Associates lawyers will remain. And Darius, if you like to leave, you can if you wish to.
Yes, thank you so much. I will take your leave. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks, Darius. Pleasure speaking to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we can now transition to the coffee corner.